Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're going to pop the hood on the massive administrative machine of an ancient superpower, the Gupta Empire. You know, when we think of ancient empires, our minds usually go straight to conquering kings, legendary battles, and expanding borders. But what actually keeps an empire running, day in and day out? How in the world do you manage laws, collect taxes, and regulate trade across a vast, sprawling subcontinent without any modern technology? Honestly, understanding a 1,500-year-old system like this completely changes how we view human civilization and how the very concept of modern governance evolved. And as you'll see, the secret sauce here was a highly structured, almost surprisingly modern bureaucracy.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover Section 1, the Imperial Center. Section 2, provinces, districts, and cities. Section 3, grassroots village administration. Section 4, the Gupta military machine. And finally, Section 5, economy and the tax system. Just to anchor us in time really quickly, we are looking at the Gupta period, so we're talking roughly 275 to 550 AD. Now, at the absolute top of this massive bureaucratic pyramid was, of course, the king. The king held incredible, extensive power and functioned as the ultimate authority. But he definitely wasn't running the show alone. He was assisted by a highly dedicated council of ministers. Think of them as the ultimate brain trust of the empire.
All right, Section 1, the Imperial Center, the King's Inner Circle. Look at how ridiculously specialized this royal court was. Instead of just a handful of lords trying to do a little bit of everything, they actually had very specific departments. For instance, they had a chief justice, known as the Mahadandananayak. They had a dedicated head of police, the Danadapashika. The empire's wealth? That was managed by the head of the royal treasury, or Bandagar Adrakela. Get this, they even had an inspector of all central departments, the Sarvadaksha, whose entire job was to keep everyone else in check. And remarkably, they even had a specific head of education, the Vinay Stithi Sansafapak. It's exactly the kind of highly compartmentalized organization you'd expect to see in a modern government today.
Moving right along to Section 2, provinces, districts, and cities, we're zooming out from the center now.
And this brilliantly illustrates how power was distributed. The Gupta state didn't just rule randomly. Everything was meticulously categorized. The entire empire was divided up into massive provinces known as Bhuktis. Those provinces were then broken down into smaller, more manageable districts called Vishayas. And finally, at the very bottom, those districts were made up of the lowest unit of administration, the villa or the village. So how did they actually pass power down this massive chain? Well, the provinces, those giant Bhuktis, were governed by high imperial officers, or sometimes even members of the royal family. These heavy-hitting governors were called Uparakas or Kumaramatyas, and they were appointed directly by the king himself. From there, the provincial governor would appoint an official called the Ayuktika to run the day-to-day of those smaller districts, the Vishayas. And the cities? They were run by a specialized council called the Pora, which handled all the municipal administration.
Now, pay really close attention to this part, because this is where the Gupta system gets super fascinating. The district offices, the Adhikarana, weren't just stuffed with a bunch of royal bureaucrats sent over from the capital. No, they actually included local community and trade representatives. The city council had a seat for the Nagara Shreshti, the head of the city merchants. It included the Sartavaha, the caravan leader. They even made room for the Prathama Kulika, head of the artisan community, and the Prathama Kayasta, head of the scribes. Plus, of course, they had their dedicated record keepers, the Pustapalas. I just love how this system so beautifully blends absolute royal power with local grassroots commerce and community leadership.
Section 3, grassroots village administration, the lowest unit of power. Down at the very bottom of the hierarchy was the village, the villa. This was the true grassroots level. This is where the actual farming happened, where daily life unfolded, thousands of miles away from the king's fancy court. This level was managed entirely locally by the Gramapeti, the village headman, who worked alongside the Grama Vriddhas, the village elders. But it wasn't like they were totally isolated. Records show that sometimes these villages interacted with much higher offices, like the Astakula Dakarama, which was a sort of board where representatives of different village groups would step up to function above the standard village level when the occasion called for it. All right, shifting gears, Section 4, the Gupta military machine, defending the empire. Let's start with a rather stark reality of the ancient world. Forced labor, or vishti, was practiced in the royal army.
While the core of the Gupta army was indeed a professional, cash-paid fighting force, they still heavily supplemented their sheer manpower needs for large campaigns and logistics through forced labor drawn straight from the general population. Now, what's really interesting here is the intense specialization of this military leadership. Look at this breakdown. They had a specific minister of peace and war, the Sandhivigrahika. They had a top-level commander-in-chief, the Mahabalakrita. The Bhatta Shapati specifically and only commanded the cavalry and infantry. They even had a dedicated quartermaster, the Rana Bandagarika, who was strictly in charge of storing and supplying the weapons, battle axes, bows, swords, the whole shebang. And, absolutely my favorite title on this list, the Mahamipalupati, the controller of the elephant force. Every single aspect of ancient warfare was meticulously categorized, which of course raises the big question, how on earth do you pay for all of these ministers, scribes, quartermasters, and elephant controllers? And that brings us to Section 5, Economy and the Tax System. The fuel for this massive bureaucracy. The Gupta economy actually experienced a pretty massive shift during this period. Long-distance trade started to decline, largely because there was this huge, growing international demand for silk from China, and that really undercut some of India's traditional trade dominance. So, to compensate, the empire essentially triggered an intense agricultural boom. The state took exclusive ownership of agriculture. They aggressively brought uncultivated, virgin land under the plow. Scholars like Varahamihara were literally writing out detailed instruction manuals on planting fruit trees to maximize crop yield. With trade dipping, extracting revenue from the land became the absolute lifeblood of the empire. And because they desperately needed that income to keep the machine running, the Gupta state unleashed an absolute avalanche of taxes. I mean, every conceivable aspect of economic life was regulated and taxed. If you were a farmer, you paid a plow tax, the halabakara, you paid a grazing tax, the chakrasana, and an irrigation tax called bidak bog. If you were a merchant, you paid sales taxes, toll taxes, the list goes on. But get this, they even had a tax called vata bohuta. This was a specific tax collected just to maintain the spiritual rites performed for the winds and spirits. That's right, they literally taxed the wind and the spirits to keep the imperial treasury full. No way around the tax man, right? Which leaves us with this final thought. Today, we've explored an empire that had highly specific departments for everything from elephant control to local record keeping. We've seen an administrative system that actually gave local merchants a seat at the table in district governance, while at the very same time relying on forced labor and taxing absolutely everything, including the wind. So what does this all mean? I leave you with this question. With such a complex web of taxes and countless, highly specialized officials, was the Gupta Empire's government a total marvel of ancient efficiency, or was it just an inescapable administrative maze? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep wondering and keep learning.